As I'm sure you can imagine, every generation as they enter the workforce arouses a particular amount of ire, mistrust, confusion amongst generations that are already there. Certainly Gen X was no exception, the boomers were no exception. For the millennials in particular, there are sort of two camps with respect to their impressions of this population. And they're related, but from different sides of the spectrum. So one camp would suggest that they are educated, high-achieving, pressured, put under a lot of pressure, a little bit overscheduled, all of the things that sort of define the way they were brought up, that suggests a very earnest, high-achieving population eager to succeed. The other camp looks at it a slightly different way and codes this generation as entitled, needy, fragile with respect to their emotions, all of the more sort of negative characteristics that go hand in hand with feeling a lot of pressure, a large generation moving through an increasingly narrow siphon that therefore feels extraordinarily vulnerable to any derailment in their path.
So do those two ideas in reality coexist? Is a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B?
Yes, I think they very much coexist. I think like any young people of any age, there are certain transitions that have to occur as you move from the shelter of family, school, protection to navigating your way through the world as an adult. One of the things that's interesting about millennials is that happens a little later in life than it did for preceding generations. I also think that part of the defining characteristics of millennials manifests itself in both positive and negative ways. The positive being their extraordinary desire and ability to contribute to organizations, the negative being sort of the subset of environmental conditions that they need in order to do so.
Well, in this edition of EmoryBusiness.com, we're focusing particularly on women in the workplace. And you and I were talking a little off air that it may not be necessarily fair to prescribe certain subsets or descriptions to a particular gender in a generational group. But that being said, are there some things that you feel may be unique to women in this millennial generation as compared to their counterparts in other generations?
Oh, absolutely. You know, this was the Title IX generation, born under girl power. You have had a lot of role models in the media, in politics, in business who have served to pave the way for these women and their aspirations in ways that perhaps didn't occur before. Since the 70s, you've had an increasing number of women relative to men in college, but it has really exacerbated such that right now you've got 56% of college students are women. I read a statistic that I've never been able to verify, but my understanding is that 75% of elected offices in high schools are held by females. It is certainly the case, empirically and anecdotally, that when you look around at college organizations, at activities and clubs, you see lots and lots of females leading the pack and men who have gotten used to looking up to their female counterparts to really be calling the shots. So of course, that sets up a certain way that women navigate their way through organizations that you then see in the workforce.
That's interesting because we are very much in this situation in the workforce now where there are a growing number, but still a very small number of female CEOs, and of course they're part of a different generation. Somewhere along the line there's a disconnect, and maybe we can talk about that at another time, but I am curious about you have more and more millennials in the workforce now, and you're actually getting some in leadership roles. So what are those defining characteristics of women millennials that would be in a position of power, per se, in an organization?
Well, it's hard to really talk about women in significant positions of power who are of the millennial generation because the oldest group is still mid-30s. One thing we know is that the salary gap is much lower at the gender salary gap is much lower at the younger end and the lower end of the organizational hierarchy than at the higher end. So it's approximately 2%, which could be variance. It could be fewer women in at least the technology engineering part of the STEM, professions. So women haven't really experienced a ceiling in terms of millennials in the workforce. I think that will be very interesting to see. Women as managers, maybe not as senior leadership, who are millennials, I don't think that they behave in any of the self-consciously female ways that were, for example, indicative of my generation. When I looked at my counterparts who were MBAs entering the workforce, I saw women dressing as close to male as possible, coding what were traditionally gender male behaviors in terms of their management style that sometimes were effective but often lacked authenticity. They were sort of roles that they were putting on. I think younger women in the workforce now are just the people that they've always been. They're used to speaking up in meetings. They're used to taking charge. There's all sorts of invigorating ways to think about women as managers. The other thing, I don't know if you've seen this, there was recent research that suggests that groups run by women are more high performing than groups run by men because empathy and listening trump other kinds of characteristics like experience and talent pool in terms of the overall behavior of the group, and women are, at least historically, slightly more apt to engage in those behaviors.
That's interesting. Would you say then, as your role too, also leading the BBA program here at Goizueta, you're around young people every day in the classroom, and I can tell that really energizes you and you love that group. Would you say that there's more of a homogenous approach to how they work together than in previous generations then? You're talking about women being themselves in leadership roles and no longer dressing like men or trying to take on some of those traits. I mean, is that even occurring in the classroom, that it's just there's really no difference anymore? It's just one group?
I think there's some things that used to be subtle differences that I don't see as much anymore. I remember when I first started teaching having to stop a class and say, would any woman like to raise her hand now, when I was trying to get a class discussion going. I can't think of a time when I had to do that in years. I do see some particular differences. It is still the case that more men go into the investment banking side of finance than women do. I do not think that's math phobia. It might be a little bit about lifestyle decisions, the inability to have any sort of a life when you're working 100 hours a week. I think that women are every bit as willing to engage in hardcore analytic tasks, but more likely to also be the ones who are interested in more creative kinds of approaches. They more naturally are in touch with out-of-the-box solutions that imply a certain amount of artistic creativity than I think men are at that age. And I don't necessarily think that that's a proclivity or a talent so much as it's just a comfort level with what a particular cohort is inclined to do.
Changing gears a little bit and taking more the manager focus. And we mentioned before we rolled that it's not really 5 generations in the workforce anymore. It's barely 4.
Correct.
But there's still some interesting dynamics there. You could have a Gen X manager managing a millennial, or even maybe a boomer, managing. What are some of the bottlenecks and problems there that the both manager and millennial employee need to be aware of?
Well, that's a great question. And I would say, again, I don't have hard data to back this up, but my sense of it is that Gen X managers who are female are actually tougher on their female millennial employees and less understanding maybe than some male managers, and I think that's because of what they experienced when they came in. the toughest relationship is unequivocally between Gen X and Millennial. And that's not shocking, right? That's the big brother, big sister versus, younger sib, as opposed to a more parental role that you might see between a boomer manager and a Millennial, which has a lot of coherence in terms of worldview and life choices. Those two generations see a lot of each other in each other. My favorite analogy about Gen X and Millennials entering the workforce is about babies learning to swim. So when Gen X was coming of age, if you read the literature, and you would have to read it because there was no online access, if you read the literature on teaching a child to swim, a baby to swim, it said that babies float. Throw them in the deep end and they'll float. If you observe the parent of a millennial, and there are no longer infants who are millennials, but if you observe the parent of a millennial, say 10 years ago, teaching their child to float, what you would have seen is a child surrounded by all kinds of flotation devices with the mom or the dad 2 inches from them in warm water there to shelter and protect them. And I think that's been very true throughout their whole lives, that millennials have experienced that, but nowhere more so than in transitioning into the workforce. So Gen X was thrown into the workforce. You'll float. There might be a training manual somewhere, but just do your best. You'll figure it out. And if you think, maybe you weren't a great fit for our organization in the first place. Millennials, we have seen training go from a couple of days or a week to 3 to 6 months. There's even a word for it now. It's called onboarding. And Gen X managers are expected to put forth the effort and the time, the human capital, to train this generation in a way that they never received themselves. And in part, that's a source of frustration because it's taking away from the other things they need to do. In part, it's a source of frustration because it's not fair. But it turns out that from an organizational perspective, if you want to lower retention, if you want to increase the degree to which any population, but in particular this population, is engaged in the work, understands what they need to do, all of those things, that upfront training yields enormous dividends. It's just not without a particular interpersonal dynamic that can be somewhat volatile.
So continuing a little more down this road of how you onboard an employee now, you don't just throw them to the wolves, if you will. That has to be maddening for both sides because Xers want to just get the job done. Millennials, I get the feeling, they want to succeed and they want to succeed quickly. So a 6-month onboarding period has to be very frustrating to them, and it also has to be frustrating to the Xers trying to move forward.
Yeah, you're absolutely right that Xers are incredibly pragmatic. And getting the job done, if we flip to the female for a moment, let's just assume that there's some amount of a conventional household dynamic going on where the woman is taking the larger share of making sure like the kids are getting picked up at the end of the day or dinner's on the table or whatever that subset of balancing your life with your work involves. So taking time to do something at work to what feels to them like to coddle or to overparent their employees that's stopping them from doing actual parenting at home can be a source of incredible frustration. On the other hand, when you've got a well-trained millennial, this is an educated, high-performing generation that can make your job much easier and let you get home to the rest of your life. So there is a happy side to that. From the millennial standpoint, I don't think there's frustration in training. My feeling is that millennials, well, empirically, they've been taught to the test, right? This was a generation that did not pass go unless they hit particular marks, and those marks were imposed by institutions that were recovering from a lack of marks in preceding generations. So they haven't really been asked to do very much without direct feedback, without a grading rubric, without a knowledge of what counts, how things should be done, an example of what the right thing is. So ambiguity is a little hard for them. Lack of feedback is certainly frustrating for them. They're looking for a "you are here" kind of map. And upfront training and continual touch points where they know if they are deviating from the expected path are really useful to them. Now, to a Gen X manager, that might sound like help me do my job or I need love, but to the millennial, it's help me live up to your expectations so that I can succeed and make meaningful contributions. And you're right, of course, success does also imply moving up through the organization, but there's a lot of ways that millennials define success, and moving the organization forward, even if it doesn't come with promotions or salary, acknowledgement, are also very important to them.
Do you recommend managers and employees have these sort of frank conversations as, down to the point of like, I'm millennial, you're an Xer, how are we going to work together?
Well, I think like anything else, that can be a little weird, right? You don't want somebody coming in and telling you their Berkman colors, or, you don't want to put too many trappings around what should be a more natural conversation, but certainly acknowledging, here's the way I see the world, here's what I need to succeed, I need to learn how you see the world, how I can help you succeed. Those are very valuable conversations. The other thing that we have to be very aware of is duration of time is a little bit different for millennials. When they say something like frequent feedback, they don't mean once a quarter. They might mean once a week. Don't let things that are problematic simmer for too long, because then it feels to them like a shock when they hear that a particular behavior isn't working very well. They are, though, contrary to popular belief, very open to frank conversations and correction, as long as there's a way for them to get back on a path. They love coaching. They've been coached their whole lives, and they respond very well to sort of correction and form before you're cut from the team, if that makes any sense.
It does. And again, no real difference you see between men and women millennials in that behavior?
Well, sure. I mean, there's always gender differences. Women are, I think, sometimes less able to distance themselves emotionally from a professional environment than men are, or at least men put on more bravado, which makes it a little bit easier to give a man feedback and not worry that you have upset his ego or his, central feelings that day than to a woman. But I think women, to me, are more resilient in the long run. They may initially be a little taken aback by very direct feedback, but they're more likely to then put it on themselves to regroup and move forward.
So let's take that long-term view for a second.
Sure.
If one of these things on your desk in your office were a crystal ball, and you're looking ahead, you say millennials aren't in the C-suite now, but then let's keep it going with the women in the workplace. When a woman does take over the corner office at a company and she's a millennial, this is however many years in the future, what can we expect from that organization? What can we expect from that person? More empathy? What would you kind of think the makeup would be?
Wow, that's a great question. So what we know about Gen Xers is that they grew up without necessarily a lot of support from institutions, and therefore not a lot of respect for the status quo. So as they have evolved into C-suites and into creating their own organizations, they've really imploded what we think of as particular organizational structures or dynamics, and women, to the extent that they've done that, have been just as willing to do it as men, although a lot of the new leading organizations are tech-driven and still driven by men. I think when millennial women get there, at least I hope, there won't be gender differences in that respect, but millennials are much more likely to work within an organizational structure than outside it or around it. So I think I would assume that you would see more change from within, maybe women versus men, maybe a little bit more loyalty to the people inside the organization instead of the idea that there's always something better outside that one should go get in terms of human capital or other sorts of resources. I think people are going to be surprised to see a generation that never considered itself the weaker sex, physically, mentally, in terms of stamina, in terms of drive. that should do more to create parity than any generation where the woman felt like she had something to prove when she got there.
This has been wonderful, Andrea. I would like to ask you, though, because you work with this group so much, if you have any parting shots or things that you hope people will recognize about millennials, both men and women, moving forward.
I would say there's a couple of things. One, something I always talk about when I close any talk on millennials is a blog I once read by a woman who was responding to the notion that this generation wasn't so special. And what she said in the blog was, we didn't call ourselves special, you did. We didn't go out and engrave those participation trophies, you did. But towards the end of what she wrote, she said something that's very, very salient to me, which is that she, as a millennial, on behalf of millennials, said, we spend our days fearing our invisible duplicate who has everything we have on our resume plus one. And when I read that, I sort of went, oh, because that is so defining of this population. They feel this need to continuously achieve, to continuously perform, and at all times, they're looking over their shoulder for somebody who's just a little bit more than they are. And so that enables me, and I hope others who think about it this way, to feel a particular compassion for millennials' fear of derailment, need for feedback and affirmation, desire to know where they stand. The other side of that, that's embedded in what I just said, is that I find that millennials so want to make a difference. They so want to contribute to the greater good of the organization. And male or female, they are very determined that the world they leave will be better than the one they found in a way that I think is profoundly different from previous generations and really makes me very hopeful for what they'll accomplish in the future.